York City at 9:08 p.m. with his family at his side. Hillary and I send our deepest condolences to the entire Nixon family. We hope that Tricia and Edward Cox and their son Christopher, and Julie and David Eisenhower and their children, Jenny, Alex, and Melanie, know that the best wishes of all their fellow Americans are with them during their moment of sorrow. It's impossible to be in this job without feeling a special bond with the people who have gone before. And I was deeply grateful to President Nixon for his wise counsel on so many occasions on many issues over the last year. His service to me and to our country during this period was like the rest of his service to the nation for nearly half century. He gave of himself with intelligence and devotion to duty, and his country owes him a debt of gratitude for that service. We face today a world of increasing uncertainty and difficult challenges, but it is a world of great opportunity, in no small part because of the vision of Richard Nixon during a particularly difficult period of the Cold War. He understood the threat of communism, but he also had the wisdom to know when it was time to reach out to the Soviet Union and to China. All Americans, indeed all people throughout the world, owe him what he regarded as the ultimate compliment. He was a statesman who sought to build a lasting structure of peace. To be sure, he experienced his fair share of adversity and controversy, but his resilience and his diligent desire to give something back to this country and to the world provide a lesson for all of us about maintaining our faith in the future. In spite of everything, that faith led President Nixon to leave his mark on his times as few national figures have done in our history, and led him to continue to serve right up to the end of his life. Indeed, no less than a month before his passing, he was still in touch with me about the great issues of this day. Again, I say the sorrow and the best wishes of the American people are with President Nixon's family. We thank them, and our prayers are with them. Thank you.
Have you spoken to the family, Mr. President?
I have. I spoke with both Tricia Cox and Julie Eisenhower this evening, and we had a very good visit.
Well, are you going to the funeral?
Excuse me?
Are you going to go to the funeral?
I intend to go, yes.
Who will be, do you know?
The family has not made announcements, and I'm not sure they've made final decisions. It's my understanding that the funeral will be in California, and they'll announce something about it probably tomorrow.
Will all the presidents be going, former presidents?
I can't say that.
Can you tell us something about your relationship with Mr. Nixon?
Yes, well, we made contact with each other shortly after, I think shortly after the election, either that or shortly after I came in here. And then, as you will remember, I had him up to the White House for a visit. We talked frequently on the phone. I sought his advice about a number of issues in foreign policy, and we talked quite a lot about Russia. We had a good long visit right before he went to Russia, and as I said, just a month ago, today I think, he penned his last letter to me of his thoughts on that trip and his advice. And so our relationship continued to be warm and constructive throughout the period of my presidency, and he went out of his way to give me his best advice. And I was incredibly impressed with the energy and the vigor and, frankly, the rigor that he brought to analyzing this issue. And thank you very much.
I believe in the American dream because I have seen it come true in my own life. And I want you to know that as far as you're concerned, I want your dreams to come true as well. You will suffer disappointments in life, and sometimes you will be very discouraged. It is sad to lose, but the greatest sadness is to travel through life without knowing either victory or defeat.
Steve Bull, White House aide to President Nixon, and it's been about a day and a half now since Mr. Nixon's death. What kind of remembrances have you been going through your mind in this past 36 hours?
He has always been really at the center of my life and the life of so many of my friends and colleagues over the last quarter century. And the difficult thing to comprehend is that that core seems to have gone away. And I don't know what the future is going to be for so many of us who have been so affected, for better or for worse, by our association with Mr. Nixon.
When did you first meet him?
First met him in 1968 during the presidential campaign.
And what did you do for him at that time?
I was doing advance work out in the hustings, various campaign stops being set up. And I remember the first time I met him was on the airplane. John Ehrlichman introduced me to him.
What were your first impressions?
First impressions was this is a giant of a man with a great intellect. And I was just impressed by his bearing and by his presence.
How many years did you end up spending with him?
Well, I was in the White House during the entire tenure of his presidency, and then went out to San Clemente with him at resignation, remaining through about early November of 1974.
Hugh Sidey is Washington contributing editor for Time magazine. Mr. Sidey, you remember the first time you met Richard Nixon?
I do indeed. It was 1957. It was Eisenhower's second inaugural. He was vice president. And I was working for the Old Life magazine, and I was covering the inaugural balls, and there was Nixon, the heir apparent then. Ike had been reelected, and Mr. Nixon, of course, was the hot young Republican who was expected to inherit the cloak. And so I went around and met him that night, and I remember he had his white tie or whatever it was on in the ball, and he said, "Well," and that Nixon had, "Well, welcome to Washington." But you have to remember that even then, we thought he was a bit of a rascal, we people in the press. In fact, more than that. He'd already been through the Helen Gahagan-Douglas campaign. We'd had the Chequers speech. We'd been through Alger Hiss and Whittaker Chambers. So he was kind of evil incarnate to a young reporter. It took a long time to get to know the man and to understand what Steve talks about, this dimension of him as somebody who calculated, looked at the world, and devised really an amazing strategy to hopefully bring peace closer.
Over the years, how did you get to know him better?
Well, it was a professional relationship. I'm not sure anybody really had anything more with Mr. Nixon. But for instance, in the 1958 campaign, he was the only one out there. It was a disaster for the Republicans, but they put me on the airplane, and for 6 weeks we bumped through the skies of this country, and Nixon was the lone campaigner, and we literally lived together on that plane, and Tricia and Julie were along, and Pat was along. We were up in Alaska, which was still a territory. I remember one night, it was Halloween, or around there. It was in the fall, of course, and we'd been in Alaska, far away, a propeller airplane. It takes, so many hours to get up there. And coming out of Alaska, we decided we would give Nixon a pair of red flannel long underwear, and we weren't sure how he'd react. But by George, beneath that, the wingtips and the white collar, there was a regular guy, because we gave him these, and we were flying over the Yukon or something, and he unfurled them, and he put them on him, and he went up and down the aisle, and we just had a great time. So these little things did come out, even as we went along and listened to the speeches and listened to him campaign.
Steve Bull, were there times when the White House staff would have those kind of moments with Richard Nixon?
I think they were far and few, very, very seldom, really. I mean, he was a man who was the president first, almost the institutional being. And as far as the staff is concerned, there was a distance between them.
Did he ever spend a lot of time with the staff?
I think the most time, I think that was limited probably to John Ehrlichman and Bob Haldeman. Probably limited to those two for staff contact.
What were his requests or demands in advancing for him? Was it different from anyone else that you knew of? Did he have special things he wanted?
Just perfection. No, the demands were transmitted to us by the Chief of Staff, Bob Haldeman, and John Ehrlichman, who was the tour director during the 1968 campaign. But as far as personal demands, no, there were none of those that we were aware of anyway.
On August 8, 1974, he resigned, and you were with him that
Yes.
day.
Mm-hmm.
In his memoirs, which were published in 1978, he talks about you riding down the elevator with the family, or it would have been down the elevator,
Mm-hmm.
right, to the room where he was going to address the staff.
Yes.
If I may read, he says this: "Just after 9:30, we went to the elevator. As we rode down, Steve Bull described the arrangement of the East Room and told each member of the family where they were supposed to stand behind me on the platform during my speech. He mentioned that there would be 3 television cameras. At that news, Pat and Tricia became very upset. It was too much, they said, that after all the agony television had cost us, its prying eyes should be allowed to intrude on this last and most intimate moment of all. That's the way it has to be," I said. "We owe it to our supporters. We owe it to the people." Do you remember that?
Not necessarily those words, but yes, I remember the general impression. I remember riding down on that elevator. It was riding down from the private quarters down to the state floor, and he was about to give his farewell address to the staff. What was interesting was, as it turned out, although it was in front of national television, it really was an intimate presentation to the staff, kind of his extended family. And I think that was being reflected in, certainly Mrs. Nixon's reluctance to have cameras there, that it was going to be an intimate moment.
We stood for a moment, steeling ourselves for the ordeal beyond the doors. Pat decided not to wear her dark glasses, and Eddie, who would Eddie have been?
Ed Cox.
Oh, Ed Cox, said that it was proper because this was not a moment to be ashamed of tears. I nodded to Steve Bull, and the doors were open. Let's take a look at a little bit of his farewell speech.
We think that when someone dear to us dies, we think that when we lose an election, we think that when we suffer a defeat, that all is ended. We think, as T.R. said, that the light had left his life forever. Not true. It's only a beginning, always. The young must know it. The old must know it. It must always sustain us, because the greatness comes not when things go always good for you, but the greatness comes, and you're really tested, when you take some knocks, some disappointments, when sadness comes. Because only if you've been in the deepest valley can you ever know how magnificent it is to be on the highest mountain. And so I say to you on this occasion, we leave proud of the people who have stood by us and worked for us and served this country. We want you to be proud of what you've done. We want you to continue to serve in government if that is your wish. Always give your best. Never get discouraged. Never be petty. Always remember, others may hate you, but those who hate you don't win unless you hate them. And then you destroy yourself. And so we leave with high hopes, in good spirit, and with deep humility, and with very much gratefulness in our hearts.
It was later or earlier during that speech to the staff that he also put on his glasses for the first time in public, at least that we know of.
It's the first time I can recall him wearing glasses in public, and it seemed to be almost a symbolic gesture that now at this final day, the real person started emerging.
Why did he do that? Do you know? Why he had his glasses on at that time?
Well, first of all, the obvious reason, he was reading from a card he needed to see.
It was the days before there were major teleprompters and...
Yeah, teleprompters and perhaps typeface from a speech typewriter. And these were handwritten notes he was reading from off a card.
Hugh, Sidey, you were there that day?
I was there, and just a comment about the night before when he gave his speech telling the American people he would leave. I have been privileged to see many of these White House events. I was with Kennedy in Dallas, and we came back and we stood on the lawn on that tragic night. I watched the city be burned and looted after Martin Luther King was killed. And this was a spectacle of different texture, but just as moving. There were 10,000 people out on Pennsylvania Avenue the night before. Half of them were cheering, half of them were weeping. I'll always remember Dan Rather standing on a chair in a spotlight declaring the end of the world or whatever he did at such times like that. And then we went from that emotional night into that morning and the farewell, and really, there was just nothing like it in my 40 years of covering. I remember talking to Dick Strout, the old liberal that wrote for the New Republic. He's dead now, but he remembered it. He said maybe Pearl Harbor, where people gathered on the White House lawn and felt this terrible, terrible kind of crisis or some emptiness in their lives. But it was one of those amazing moments in our national life, and that good old White House stood there and kind of held us all together.
Philip later joins us from the White House lawn this morning. He is Deputy Chief of Staff at the White House. Good morning, sir.
Good morning, Connie.
Thanks for joining us. You were the person who told President Clinton about the death of former President Nixon. How did you find out?
Well, we had been in touch with the family, and their Chief of Staff, the President's Chief of Staff, called me, and President Clinton was meeting at a dinner with his cabinet. And it was a poignant moment because they had been reflecting on the historical relationship of the President and his cabinet. I informed President Clinton, and immediately as he was about to make the concluding remarks, in a very somber tone, he announced the death of President Nixon to his cabinet, offered his remarks, and then he and Mrs. Clinton adjourned to their family quarters for President Clinton to call President Nixon's daughters.
Well, do you have any idea when President Clinton and former President Nixon first met?
I don't know the specific time. I do know that they developed a very warm relationship because President Clinton had a very great respect for the geopolitical understandings of President Nixon. And as recently a month before President Nixon's death, he had shared with President Clinton a letter in which he gave some of his views on foreign policy. And after, in fact, President Clinton made the announcement to the American people that night of his predecessor's death, as he walked back into the White House, he shared with several of us the great respect he had for the geopolitical understanding, the foreign affairs views of his predecessor.
When, after the announcement was made, how soon did the White House have to kick in terms of its responsibilities for the next several days?
Well, immediately. It's very interesting to see that with the death even of a former president and world leader, matters of death and funeral arrangements are essentially a family affair. And President Clinton has sought to respect the wishes and preferences of President Nixon's family throughout. But immediately the statement was made to the press corps, and then we had to deal with, on an interagency basis, with the Defense Department on various issues, preparing a proclamation that establishes Wednesday as a national day of mourning and requiring that all American flags be flown at half-staff, dealing with the State Department for communiques to be sent out to the diplomatic corps to advise them of the funeral arrangements. And so as you can understand, there's a matter of the personal side of this, but also a bit of the preparation organizationally for dealing with the federal government and the incumbent president's responsibilities.
U.S. News and World Report comes out tomorrow, and in it, according to an advance release, it is said that the former President Nixon had asked that President Clinton come to his funeral and speak there.
Well, his family had conveyed that request, and President Clinton was very pleased to have this opportunity. He indicated in his comments to President Nixon's daughters that he was honored to have this opportunity.
What's the logistics in terms of the former president's body, where it is now, and what kind of What kind of transportation will be used to get it to California? What goes on?
The federal government will be providing an airplane for President Nixon's family and his body to be flown back to California, where he had such deep roots and so many fond memories. And then the next day, there will be support planes of military to go out to California, and there will be 2 congressional planes organizing a congressional delegation to go. And then Air Force One will include not only President Clinton and Mrs. Clinton, although she may be there in advance, but also a very high-level delegation.
We think many times of when presidents die that what Americans are going to see is, as we did with John Kennedy and many others, the coffin in the rotunda, a state funeral. Not happening here?
Well, President Nixon's family requested that his body be returned to California, where he had a particular strong affinity and ties, and President Clinton has honored that request.
You have met former President Nixon.
Yes.
When?
Well, ironically, my first invitation to the White House was to attend a dinner that President Nixon and his wife were giving in honor of the engagement of their daughter Tricia to my law school classmate and friend Ed Cox. And so it's been a poignant series of conversation that I've had with my longtime friend Ed Cox in that regard these last few days.
What is he remembering today?
Well, I can't speak for that, but as I indicated, both for the incumbent president and for President Nixon's family, matters such as this, notwithstanding the legacy or the controversy of the public figure, is essentially a private family time, reminding all of us of our common mortality.
Are you getting a lot of telephone calls into the White House regarding this and messages from around the world, leaders?
We've received many, many calls, as you can understand, both in questions of sentiment to be expressed and also in terms of logistics. And I know that the Presidential Library in Yorba Linda has had similar experience.
Who gets to go to the funeral?
Well, that's very difficult because there's such an outpouring of grief and desire to pay tribute. And so it's the wishes of the Nixon family that will be observed primarily. And they are issuing the invitations to the funeral. The presidential delegation led by President Clinton will be determined in concert with the Nixon family.
Is it likely that we will see many heads of state from around the world there?
Well, because of this weekend, we have not had formal responses from the diplomatic corps, but that will be determined, and you'll hear more about that tomorrow.
Philip Lader, Deputy White House Chief of Staff, joining us live from the White House grounds this morning. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Connie.
We were just seeing some video of the White House Library in Yorba Linda. Apparently it is closed now today in memory of President Nixon, but that's probably a logistical nightmare out there right now.
Well, I can't imagine that it wouldn't be. These things always are. Steve could speak to that more. The outpouring. I was in California when he died, as a matter of fact, down in Newport Beach, not far away, and it was like God had left. The headlines in the papers, the people in the hotels and that, an amazing impact. I think we've surprised ourselves, Connie, at the affection and the regard for this man. You know, there was always the negative side of him, the dark side, but suddenly now when he dies, this outpouring is really quite phenomenal.
Steve Bull, someone once has said, many people have said, that the president's funeral is planned on the day that he's inaugurated. Is that true? I
think that the arrangements for President Nixon's funeral have changed numerous times over the years. I'm not at all surprised, however, that the ceremony is only in California and that there is going to be nothing in Washington. One thing that President Nixon has always wanted to do is to distinguish himself from every other president, living or deceased. And this is almost classic Nixon.
In 1992, I think it was February of 1992, former President Nixon sat down with us and did 2 one-hour interviews for a program we have called Book Notes. It was after the publication of his 9th book. And we have a couple clips from that. And the first one I want to show you, in which he talks a little bit about what he would have liked to have done if he couldn't have been president.
If you had to choose another profession that you haven't done, that you've observed over the years, and we want to give a try at it, what would it be?
Sportscaster. I think that'd be the greatest job in the world. I like sports. I think I would do it pretty well because I like to watch how they play and see these young people, how they meet the tests and so forth. I just love to be a sportscaster.
Why do so many politicians and political columnists talk about sports?
Because many of them have come up that way. You know, you take among the writers, Scotty Reston, for example, was a sports writer. Pegler was a sports writer. I've taken two extremes there who probably couldn't get along with each other, but nevertheless, they both like sports. And the reason is that politics is the greatest sport there is. It's competitive. People win, people lose, people come back, etc. So I think that's the reason that you see an affinity between the politicians and the sports writers.
And the Washington Times says kind of the same thing in its headline this morning. President covered all bases when it came to sports. Steve Bull, what do you remember about his love for sports?
I think he liked the contest. He liked closure on every event. It was like an election every afternoon that there was a sporting event, regardless of what the sport was, whether it was football or baseball. He was an avid sports fan, not a competitor himself, an observer of it.
Did he talk about it a lot in any off time?
Yeah, sometimes he did.
Yeah, you know, I was going here the last couple of days through the old photographs and that. He posed with almost every sport known to man. There's a picture of him with a cricket bat. There's a picture of him on the deck of the Columbia, the America Cup racer in sailing. There's with baseball, basketball. As Steve said, he was an observer. He wasn't all that good at it himself, but he was fascinated, and whenever it came up there, why, he would inquire about it, and he'd have a little shot taken of himself. Oh, he was universal. There was even a picture of him from the Spanish embassy posing as kind of a bullfighter with his face over this picture that had been drawn.
In his memoirs, he says he had, in his early years, he had another ambition, though. He writes, "In the daytime, I could see the smoke from the steam engines. Sometimes at night, I was awakened by the whistle of the train, and then I dreamed of far-off places I wanted to visit someday. My brothers and I played railroad games, taking the parts of engineers and conductors. I remember the thrill of talking to Everett Barnum, the Santa Fe railroad engineer who lived in our town. All through grade school, my ambition was to be a railroad engineer."
Listen, let me tell you, any great politician or statesman has to have an element of romance in him. And I think there he talks about it. And all through the years, and Steve could attest to this, he would sit on beaches or at Camp David or in Air Force One, and his mind was way out there. It was all over the globe. A very romantic man in many ways when it came to this idea of what lay ahead and what he wanted to do.
Phone lines are open in the East and West. We'd invite you to join in on our conversation this morning. You'll see the phone numbers at the bottom of your screen. We'll go ahead and take our first call from Vienna, Virginia. Good morning.
I'd like to comment on about Mr. Nixon. In today's world, we're talking and worrying about our young people. And here is a man who lied to the American people, not once, but many times. And he could never say, "I lied." How can people sit there today and he swore to uphold our Constitution, and he was the man who almost made it impossible for us to even function as a country with a Constitution.
Mr. Sidey?
Well, I think that's an oversimplistic statement. True, however, Mr. Nixon did lie. Mr. Nixon felt in his heart, I think, that there was a greater good involved, as many presidents have felt in such matters. Mr. Nixon got caught, paid the price. It was laid out, suffered for it, but I can't say in the long run that perhaps he was any worse than some of the other presidents that I have covered in this regard. Dealing with what is absolutely true, dealing with what you would call situational ethics, that's very difficult. But Mr. Nixon will always be marked by that period of Watergate when indeed he did not tell the truth.
Indian Rock, Florida. Good morning.
Good morning. Yes, please. I'd like to, first of all, I'd like to express my condolences to family of President Nixon. And I remember President Nixon as I was in my 20s in Yugoslavia, when he visited Yugoslavia. He passed by me with about 10 feet away from it. And it was fascinating to see the person with that capacity, intellectual capacity and knowledge and impression that he left on us, especially my generation. And when I came to the United States in 1973, late in 73, and right after that he was impeached, I was rather shocked with sort of very much ignorance of capacity of that American public on a person with such a great intellectual capacity and world leadership that it was confusing to me to accept that entire world respected the man so much, and yet in his own country here, people rather smear his intellect and his achievement with something that, to me, till the day I die, I will never be able to understand.
Thank you very much, Florida. Mr. Bull, did you see a difference in the way that he was treated here in the United States than he was abroad?
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, he's a revered figure overseas. His intellect was indeed respected. It far superseded the personal observations that had been made about him and questions about his own veracity in very limited instances.
Connie, in 1974, that summer, just before he was forced to resign, he went to Moscow. And I always felt that he went there because it was going to be a friendly audience, a friendly city, and indeed it was. I think he was somewhat ecstatic. Steve would know better than I. He was close up there, but here was Nixon. People cheered him. He met Mr. Brezhnev, and they got along, and they were talking, negotiating. He was staying in the Kremlin, living in that apartment just down the road from where Lenin had been, and I think it was a very, very wonderful moment for him in the midst of this encompassing tragedy, and he got along much better than Moscow than he did back in Washington.
Martinez, California.
Yes, I think that if we're going to talk about the rehabilitation of Richard Nixon, I think we should not sell him short and just talk about Watergate, because I think that was the least of his crimes. I think that we should be specific and say that we forgive him for being an American fascist, for unleashing the deadly Henry Kissinger on the world in our name, and for subverting the Paris peace talks and prolonging the Vietnam War at a cost of untold thousands of lives for no better reason than saving face. I think he was the enemy of democracy everywhere in the world, and his legacy continues today, with you people still putting Henry Kissinger on the television. It makes me sick.
Mr. Sidey?
Well, I don't know where she came from, but I'm not sure it's this planet. I must say I disagree with almost everything she said, except that there was a disgraceful moment, more than that, in Mr. Nixon's life. But my heavens, look at this idea that he prolonged the Vietnam War. The other idea of unleashing Henry Kissinger. Henry Kissinger is one of the most remarkable public servants I've ever seen in my time here. It's just such a total disagreement. I'm kind of speechless on how to answer it. I don't think we dignify that kind of...
What impact did Henry Kissinger have in the White House while you were there?
Henry Kissinger was, in effect, the Secretary of State inside the White House. He was the architect, or the co-architect with President Nixon of foreign policy and Vietnam policy. He was indeed the keeper of the foreign policy apparatus there in the administration.
A rare chemistry between Mr. Nixon and Kissinger, wasn't it, Steve? They complemented each other in their own way.
Yes, they certainly did, and it's interesting, they are from entirely different backgrounds, and you would think that Henry Kissinger would represent everything that would be anathema to Richard Nixon, including the Harvard elitist background that he seemed to represent.
But the president furnished the political base and the power, and then he gave Kissinger that charter to go out and work, and it fit. One did one job, one did the other.
President Nixon's relationship with the press has long been written about and long been talked about by reporters and the president alike. Before we go to this, let me ask you, Steve Bull, from the insider point of view, did the president always have this kind of animosity with the press when you traveled with him, when you were with him?
I think that's overstating that there was an animosity towards the press. I think that there was an adversarial relationship that existed between the president and certain members of the press. But this characterization of it being hostile and the characterization of it being an ad hominem adversarial relationship, personal relationship, I think is incorrect.
In a book, let me just quickly put the cover up, that was written about, I think about 5 years ago now, from the president, which had a lot of memos that were written by President Nixon during it. He talks about a lot of things, but one of the things he talks about is the press, and if I need to open this so that I can quote when he talks about you, Mr. Sidey. He said, "I know that the news summary people and Ziegler feel that it's important always to include John Osborne and Hugh Sidey." John Osborne, what is?
He was the New Republic's White House correspondent.
Not because they agree with them, but because they believe they have influence with other members of the press. But deep down, what they have to realize is that the reason that everybody on the White House staff is obsessed with Sidey and Osborne is not because they have influence, but because they are considered to be president watchers, and consequently, we subconsciously tend to overreact to their criticism of presidential conduct. What we have to realize is the cold fact that both Sidey and Osborne are totally against us. They are not honest reporters. They are out to defeat us.
Yeah. Well,
I guess I need to ask your reaction to that.
There are a good many of those memos, and I was on the enemy's list, or one of them that he devised, and then I was kept off Air Force One, and that sort of thing. Just a disagreement on that. We tried to do our job. I have to say, though, looking back on this whole thing, Steve is very graceful about it, but we probably were unfair back then. I don't think we were dishonest about it, or at least we didn't try to. We made mistakes and that sort of thing. So I feel a little hurt by the president saying that we were dishonest reporters. I don't believe that. But I think we were arrogant at times. I think we still are. And probably reveled in the power we thought we had sometimes, and that we tilted too far. I remember the 1960 campaign. We liked John Kennedy. Here was the new voice. Nixon, in his own way, was the old voice out of Eisenhower. And we plainly enjoyed Kennedy's company. We favored him, and that lingering feeling that Richard Nixon was this dark and kind of brooding figure who had created great troubles in politics before went along with it. And I think if you really got down to it, we were unfair to him. And so I see some of the reason why he responded that way.
Another member of that was on the enemy's list, and a member of the press at that time, is on the phone with us now, Daniel Shore. You were at CBS at the time, sir?
That's correct.
You were listening to, I presume, to Mr. Sidey. What do you think of his comments?
Well, it was some amusement that I hear that President Nixon did not have a personal adversarial relationship with the press. Not only was I number 17 on the top 20 of his enemies, not to be confused with some of the longer enemies list that other people managed to get on, but he also ordered J. Edgar Hoover to conduct a personal FBI investigation of me with the hope of getting something on me. I do not know how much further one can go in speaking of a personal adversarial relationship.
Do you think he could have changed it in any way?
Well, I know he changed in many ways, because the end of that story was having asked the FBI to investigate me, and then when that leaked out, having then decided to issue a cover story saying rather preposterously that I was under consideration for a White House job, that ended up as an item in the bill of impeachment against him. More recently, I met him at a dinner to which he'd had me invited to hear his briefing on Russia. When I went up to him and asked if he remembered me at all, he said, "Oh, Dan, sure, damn near hired you once."
The former president spoke about his relationship with the press when he sat down with us in 1992. Let's take a look and listen at that, and then we'll come back.
Would you deal any differently with the press?
Would I?
If you were president?
Yes. I would have, if I had survived into the second term, I would have spent more time in press conferences than the rest. It was very difficult in the first term, apart from the Watergate period, which of course answers itself. But during the war, a president can't be as available to the press as he otherwise would be. But I think it's important with the press that the relationship be one of not trying to win them by having them to dinners and all that sort of thing. They're not going to be bought off by that kind of bribery. But the way to deal with them is straightforward in press conferences and the rest, and don't play favorites. I think it's very important not to play favorites. My view is that with the press, if I were giving advice to people in office, particularly a president, is don't be too available. Because if you're too available, then when you have something to say, they're not going to pay any attention. They'll say, ho hum, here it goes again.
Mr. Sidey, was he too available?
No, Mr. Nixon was quite removed, as a matter of fact, of all the presidents I've covered. In many ways, he was the most covered up and kind of behind the screen. He played it his own way. It was always a deal. When he needed you, he'd come to you, and you always had to calculate that way. That's all right. That's the way politics is. And so when now and then you could get a mutual agreement on it, but he was very, very difficult and played it his way. He was back out of sight a good deal. You couldn't be casual with Richard Nixon. Couldn't when he was vice president in those early years. It just wasn't available. He'd have to schedule a press conference, and then he'd do it on his own terms. I remember after he became president, the first time he granted Time an interview. He was going abroad. And we said, look, we're going to put you on the cover of Time magazine. Well, okay, then maybe we'll deal. So he did. He granted an interview, and I came in the day before he left for a NATO meeting and over in the Mediterranean, and I had my tape recorder. He said, no recorders, no recorders. And I said, really? No. I said, well, how should we do this? Are you going to have a transcript? No, no transcript. He said, do it the old-fashioned way. Use your pencil. So I had to go back to basics there and take it down. I always felt that he thought that if it went wrong, it didn't work out the way he wanted, he'd just deny the whole thing or say I got it mixed up because I was writing. I don't know. It seemed to me a defensive mechanism there. But there was always something like that in relation to an interview with Mr. Nixon or when you saw him.
Mr. Shore?
Yes, let me add a little factual background here. If you look further through those memos in that book that you showed earlier, you'll find constant references in those memos to let's leak this to this one, let's leak this to that one, let's leak this thing to Evans and Novak and so on. There was a certain feeling about the press that the press was there to be manipulated if you could find friendly people to whom you could give those stories. When Chuck Colson was trying to get a Howard Hunt to forge a memo by President Kennedy suggesting that he was involved in the assassination of No Din Diem, that was supposed to be leaked, according to the record, to Life magazine. The fact of the matter is that they had uses for the press if they could manipulate the press. But on the other hand, as a general view of the press as independent and sometimes critical, that the president had no use for them at all. If you look at Bill Sapphire's great book, Before the Fall, there's a chapter that is titled, "The Press is the Enemy," and that's in quotes. And the quote came from President Nixon, who constantly told his aides, remember, the press is the enemy. When he would appear at a press conference, it was more often than not to use the assembled journalists as a foil against whom he could play to the middle majority or the silent majority, as he considered his supporters to be. He hated the press, he feared the press, he feared anything he couldn't control, and luckily he could not control the press.
Steve Bull, any reaction to what you've been hearing?
He's partially correct. Mr. Shore, you're partially correct in your characterization of the relationship between President Nixon and the press. Institutionally, the press was indeed the adversary, and the Nixon White House really did have the view that you all were on the other side, and that it would be necessary to deal with you as you would with any adversary, sometimes to use you to best advantage, sometimes to go over your head, sometimes to have a press conference or not to have a press conference, depending upon what the objectives might be. My point that I made earlier, I still will stand by it, that it wasn't personal animus against any individual member of the press. Maybe there were one or two, but by and large, it was on an institutional basis. The press had to be dealt with, and the press, it seemed to President Nixon, I believe, and to many of us in the White House, is that the press was on the other side.
But why was Mary McGrory on his enemies list? Why was I on his enemies list? Why were so many journalists on specific enemies lists? Why do the Oval Office tapes use language about some of us personally that doesn't bear repeating on family television when President Nixon referred specifically to specific journalists and called them an SOB right there on Oval Office tapes? Was that institutional?
Well, let me respond to a couple of points there. First of all, I think the enemies list, which is something I never saw, is something that has been exaggerated in its purpose and in its prominence there in the White House. My recollection of it is that over in Chuck Colson's office, there was a list of people who wouldn't be invited to state dinners, and probably you didn't make the cut on that. With regard to conversations tape recorded in the Oval Office, I challenge anyone to reveal conversations that were expected to be private. We all say things in what we believe to be the privacy of our offices or around dining room tables or in the studies or whatever, and would be quite embarrassed if a transcript were revealed at some later date, and that's the case with so many of these tapes.
I'm sorry, I can't leave that there. This was not a matter of not being invited to state dinners. You will recall that the President ordered the enemies list to be turned over to the IRS in order to have audits done. He did say to John Dean at one point that in my second term, I'm going to turn these enemies lists over to the Justice Department because then we will use the power against them. Listen, I have a lot of respect for President Nixon and what he did, but I don't think that at this point we can whitewash what he really was at heart.
Well, it's not. I don't think anybody's trying to whitewash you, Dan. Let's also, though, not leave the impression that this is the first time in the history of the presidency that this has happened. I sat, and I think you did too, with Lyndon Johnson, who cut up everybody that came across his particular view at that moment, including the press, including others. And there were great intimations that he also used the FBI and the IRS, not like Nixon. I agree on that. But this is not a brand new world to find that presidents get upset and call names and try to invoke the power of the office.
You not to turn this into a debate. President Johnson called you names at times, called me names at times, and would call me up to call me names. President Nixon didn't call me, he called the FBI.
Well, are you sure that Johnson didn't call the FBI? I don't know that we can. There are some dark chapters in that world also.
Mr. Shore, a final question. Do you think that the resignation of President Nixon, that the end would have been different if his relationship with the press had been better?
No, I do not. I mean, that makes it look as though the press was responsible for it all. President Nixon was a deeply conflicted person who decided to cover up an act, and when the cover-up came apart, he continued trying to cover up. He eventually hanged himself politically with his own awful Oval Office tape. The press didn't do that. He did that to himself.
Thank you, Mr. Shore, for joining us. Let's take some more calls this morning. Columbus, Ohio, you're next.
Good morning.
Good morning.
I would like to agree with Daniel Shore wholeheartedly, and I think your guests are attempting to revise history. Richard Nixon rose to power on a series of lies. He red-baited Jerry Voorhis. He slandered Helen Gahagan Douglas. He slandered Alger Hiss. He used the intelligence agencies of this country as secret police.
I don't think he likes it.
He unleashed agent provocateurs. I think for you guys to minimize the damage that Richard Nixon did to this democracy is an absolute outrage.
Thanks very much, Columbus, Ohio. Let's take another call from Cleveland, Tennessee.
Yes, hello.
Okay, go ahead.
I believe that in remembering Richard Nixon, that one of the words that can characterize his life is one of redemption. And I do believe that Richard Nixon had some very difficult times as a person and made a lot of mistakes, but in the years since he resigned from office, that there certainly has been a redemption of him in the eyes of many Americans. He was my commander-in-chief when I was in the Air Force back in the late 60s, and I appreciate him and think a lot of him.
Thank you very much for the call.
One of the things that we've discussed here, and the word has been thrown around about hate, about how Nixon was a hater. That's very difficult. I've changed my mind about that over the years because I thought it at first too, but Nixon was a thorough professional. He was a fighter. And I'm not sure it came down to hate because look at all of the enemies that he reconciled with in the end. He went back. I'll always remember being in the Great Hall in China in 1972 and seeing he and Zhou Enlai, who'd been mortal enemies. Nobody had spoken more harshly about the Red Chinese than Richard Nixon. with their arms around each other, toasting each other. The same with the Soviet Union, the same with the press. It was this so-called hatred, or whatever it was a professional, I think, approach to this world, and it got out of hand. I don't think anybody's trying to suggest that it didn't go haywire, but I'm not sure it was as deep and abiding as some people would say.
Steve?
Mr. Sidey put that perfectly. He did not hate. In fact, if you'll recall the speech to the staff on the last day, he spoke to the point of hatred. Hatred is a self-consuming, destructive entity and quality that he said to all of us. And I think he always felt that. Yes, things did get out of hand. Certainly, it was absolutely wrong for even there to be references to using the FBI or the IRS to attack one's adversaries. But it was an adversarial matter. I don't believe that hatred was really a part of that man's character. I don't think he was very good at showing really some of the human side, and so much of it came out in such a negative way. But he was not a hater.
This is his book published in 1990, In the Arena, a memoir of victory, debate, and renewal. It is one of 9 published books that the former president wrote, and with another one coming out next month. Do we know what it's about?
I don't beats me. As a matter of fact, I think Time is going to excerpt maybe this week.
Actually, I do. I have the. I have the cover. I do not have the magazine yet, but I do have the cover that Time will be using as it goes on the newsstands tomorrow. Oh, I see. And indeed, it will be an excerpt of his 10th book, which will come out then. Let's go to Pasco, Washington next.
Thank you. Appreciate C-SPAN and the opportunity to speak. I found interesting Daniel Shore's comments that was the same sort of attitude that I think that President Nixon had to face all the way through those difficult years, and showed the adversarial relationship of some of the members of the press to Mr. Nixon as he was trying to do his job. I personally believe that Mr. Nixon's will go down as a great president and will be remembered long after people like Mr. Shore are forgotten.
Thanks, Pasco, Washington. Alexandria, Virginia.
Yes?
You're on the air. Go ahead.
Hello. I originally came from Bangkok, Thailand. I'm a student in American Foreign Policy. I have to say that to study Mr. Richard Nixon, I was amazed and I admire him so much. Through my studies, I have an impression that this country is the country that loved Kennedy and hates Richard Nixon. But after he is dead now, and you have the recollection and the reassessment of his legacy, are the American people in general ready to accept Mr. Nixon as one of them, as an ordinary American who can commit mistakes and who can do something good for the country?
Mr. Sidey?
I think that's probably a pretty accurate assessment of what's happened. As a matter of fact, it's turned around a little bit. John Kennedy isn't quite as lustrous as he used to be as we've gotten into the memoirs. Look, what we have to accept about this business of being president is that they're all flawed. I can't imagine that Thomas Jefferson would stand up very well with Dan Shore today. I'm quite sure that Dan would find flaws, or I would, or anybody else who's in this business. They're human, and they are flawed. And Nixon's were exaggerated, and they got out of control. But I think there is that feeling as we look back, and it has much to do with achievements. History, I believe, as we go down the line, tends to diminish as time goes on personal failings of a man. And so now we're beginning to concentrate. In one 16-month period, as I recall, I calculated it once. There was the opening to China, the beginning of the arms talk with the Soviet Union, the end of the war in the Sinai, the 73 war, and then the beginning of the end of Vietnam. There's no way you can ignore that. Those are epical achievements, and history will deal with that.
In his memoirs, President Nixon talked about his early relationship with the two members of Congress at that time, he and Mr. Kennedy. And he wrote this: "In those early years, we saw ourselves as political opponents, but not political rivals. We shared one quality which distinguished us from most of our fellow congressmen. Neither of us was a backslapper, and we were both uncomfortable with boisterous display of superficial camaraderie. He was shy, and that sometimes made him appear aloof. But it was shyness born of an instinct that guarded privacy and concealed emotions. I understand these qualities because I shared them. Any reaction to that?
Yes, Richard Nixon was a very private, a very shy person who was unable and perhaps unwilling to display the camaraderie that you might expect of a public person. The big problem, I believe, that ultimately brought down Richard Nixon was a disservice by his staff. No one ever knew the person Richard Nixon or Dick Nixon. Once he became president, the staff went to great lengths to project the president, capital T, capital P, the institutional being. And what we saw with Watergate, after the break-in, when in retrospect people say, well, he should have just blown the whistle and had his old buddy John Mitchell thrown in the slammer, for the first time after what, 4, 5 years in office, the person of Richard Nixon, the individual who had a human reaction, the first time there's a human reaction, we see it, and it was so different, in such contrast to anything else that it had come out of that Oval Office.
You know, that statement about Kennedy by Nixon.
Mm-hmm.
Now, there's an exaggeration. That has to be analyzed more, because Kennedy was contemptuous of Nixon. I never heard John Kennedy say anything really good about him, except that he was a skilled politician and he had some things. He just didn't like him. The Kennedys didn't like him. And their contempt came out like that. And I don't know whether Nixon, in writing that, is trying to indicate he had a close relationship. He was very envious of John Kennedy, his stylishness, his grace, his poise, his money, his ability to speak. There is no question of that. And perhaps he's trying to embrace him a little more than he really should have there, because the Kennedys were not very charitable at any time to Richard Nixon.
He does say in here that in 1950, that John Kennedy came to him with a check for $1,000 for his campaign to run for the Senate. Does that surprise you?
Well, I don't know. You know, you hedge your bets in this world. Now, right after Nixon was defeated, we flew down with Kennedy, the president-elect, to Key Biscayne or wherever it was, in which Kennedy went to Nixon, which was an unusual gesture, I have to say that. Went down to talk to Nixon, and that's when Nixon gave him the advice that he thought one of the important things to do was get enough rest. He didn't want to get too tired. Judgment went. And, well, it was kind of a nice little conversation, but didn't happen very often, though, up till that point.
Seattle, Washington.
Good morning.
Good morning.
Well, I don't know. This seems a little strange to me. You know, since I was old enough to live through the Nixon era, I remember Kent State. I can understand Mr. Bull, you know, being on Nixon's side. After all, he worked for him. But I certainly can't understand Mr. Sidey calling the lady from Martinez from another planet. It would seem to me he hasn't been residing on this one for some time. As far as the foreigners saying that the United States chose Kennedy over Nixon, why not? And the Republicans have been character assassinating Clinton even till today because of what Nixon himself done to himself. No one has done anything to Nixon but Nixon.
Thanks very much. Let's go to Westerville, Ohio next. Good morning.
Yeah, I don't want to concentrate on Watergate because I do think President Nixon had a great many accomplishments, but I would like to kind of talk about his view of it or how he saw it afterwards. I saw him in an interview, I believe, with David Frost in Britain, where he talked about, or he said that I let down my country, I let down my system of government. And I was wondering if any of you are familiar with that interview. I haven't seen any of it in the news coverage since his death. And if you haven't seen it, if you know of any of the former president's feelings about that.
The interview took place 1980.
I think it was around 1978, and I believe, as I recall, this was really about the first time that President Nixon had come out of exile in San Clemente. It was a 2 or 3 hour interview with David Frost.
Had you left his staff by that time?
Yes.
You had.
Right. But as I recall,
a couple of years ago, again, in doing those interviews with the 4 ex-presidents for Justice Berger and the bicentennial of the Constitution, we got into Watergate. He said essentially the same thing. This isn't any surprising thing. He said, it was a mistake, bad judgment, I let down, I disgraced. So he, at least at that point, was fairly candid about it.
On the phone now, Dimitri Symes, who's with the Carnegie Endowment. Mr. Symes, if I have this correct, you kind of acted as a foreign policy advisor to Mr. Nixon in the past several years?
That is correct.
What, you went with him in his latest trip to Russia?
Yes, I was with him.
What was that trip like?
It was a very interesting and a very difficult trip. It was interesting because this was the first opportunity not just for President Nixon, but for any senior American statesman to look at the Russian political situation after the elections last December, which gave surprising victory to ultranationalists under Zhirinovsky and to communists. So it was a very important trip to look at the new correlation of political forces in Russia and what does it mean for the United States. It was also very difficult because President Yeltsin, who always was supported by President Nixon, got quite irritated when President Nixon met with leaders of the opposition, particularly former Vice President Rutskoy. And President Yeltsin canceled not only his own meeting with Nixon, but meetings with all other senior government officials. I have to say that at the end of the week, President Yeltsin understood that this was a misunderstanding, and meetings with senior Russian officials were arranged again. And only 2 weeks ago, I got a phone call from a very senior Russian official who invited President Nixon to come back to Russia and to have a meeting with President Yeltsin. We were talking about that, but then, of course, the tragedy took place.
Mr. Symes, as you were traveling with the former president, did he talk about some of his foreign policy work in his earlier days?
Oh, yes, of course. He was not a man obsessed with history, but he was a man influenced by history. He remembered how he was in Russia talking to Khrushchev, having the kitchen debate. And that, of course, was the era when meetings with opposition in Russia were not thinkable. Opposition, in fact, did not exist. He talked about how he started detente. He talked about his meetings with Brezhnev. He talked about how the United States initially supported Gorbachev and saw that an alternative to Gorbachev was civil war or right-wing coup. And now, of course, came Yeltsin. And he wondered a great deal, what does it mean, this American support for whomever is in power in Russia? What does it mean for the current situation? And who may come to succeed Yeltsin?
Again, in 1992 it was when former President Nixon sat down with us. He talked about Mr. Yeltsin and Mr. Gorbachev and how he felt about them at that time. Let's take a look at what he had to say.
And Gorbachev had style. On the other hand, Yeltsin was one who came across, in their view, as being boorish. He drank too much. He was a womanizer. At least these were some of the stories that came out. He was one that wasn't in Gorbachev's league so far as style is concerned. For example, I remember one columnist who's an expert in this field, after Yeltsin had made one of his trips over here, derided him on the ground that he had such poor table manners because he licked caviar and butter off of his fingers at a state dinner. Well, let me tell you, Yeltsin may not know what fork to use at a state dinner, but he has a very sharp knife. As I looked at the two, I realized that Yeltsin was one who was a political heavyweight. And some of the experts just couldn't see that because they were blinded by style and couldn't see the real man who was beneath.
Mr. Sidey, your recollections of Mr. Nixon in terms of foreign policy and any of the stories that you covered with him?
Well, all of course, the summit meetings and the travels, and there isn't any question he was ecstatic when he got into that world. Guy climbed on Air Force One and headed off to that romantic land that I talked about earlier, and he was very good at it. He was by himself. I remember one time, he had the clumsy moments and the times that things didn't work out, but I remember in the Kremlin when they signed that first agreement, and Richard Nixon came in from one side of the room all alone. Stood there, kind of clumsily trying to do something with his hands and feet and never quite understood it. And then from the other side came the whole Politburo. Really tough-looking man. Pete Lissago of the Chicago Daily News whispered in my ear, said, I haven't seen so many hit men outside of Cook County as they came. But it symbolized this whole thing that Richard Nixon, alone again, but very confident, very much in command of the American position, and all over the world, wherever he went, China, Moscow, wherever. And he was good at it. That was his world. He loved it.
Do you agree, Mr. Bull? Was that his world? Did you see it even from the inside of the White House?
Yes. I mean, his expertise was in the foreign area. I mean, I was always impressed by his knowledge of foreign leaders, his relationship with them, his ability to deal in that foreign arena. He was the master, and he was most at home there.
Steve and I were talking before about how he was a reporter on these trips. And in this last trip, I was up about several months ago after the trip to Moscow before this one. And I said, how do you gather your information? And he went into this in some detail about how he took his walking shoes and these special clothes so he could go in the markets, and how he had his friends from other trips. And he'd go see the butcher at this market, and he'd go see the flower woman at this market. And again, like the clip showed, about how he analyzed people. He found Yeltsin's Russian, for instance. He thought it was better than Gorbachev's. And that was one reason why they were perhaps closer, the Russian people. Things like that. A meticulous reporter in foreign affairs.
Mr. Symes, how will Mr. Nixon be remembered in terms of foreign policy?
Too much about what he knew and when did he know it. And remarkably enough, what most people whom Nixon dealt with in Russia did not know was that Nixon understood some Russian. He certainly understood Russian well enough to judge the grammar of the people, where they sharp, where they quick. And when he was having a conversation with somebody, particularly with Zhirinovsky, he was at first listening to Zhirinovsky in Russian, and then was making his evaluation in English.
Mr. Symes, thank you very much for joining us. We're going to take a couple more calls in just a few moments. If you would like to join us, please feel free. Mr. Nixon and his relationship with his family, did he have the time for a family life in the White House?
I believe he did. The time with his family was very personal, very private time. I can't really speak too much to how they spent it, but I know it was a very close family. The relationships continued, obviously, until his death.
Mr. Sidey, I'm sorry,
I'm just going to say I ran into it now and then, and way back there in the 50s when we used to travel on the same airplane, now and then Tricia and Julie'd be along. And it was a normal family. I remember they rode a dog sled up in Alaska, but he had a good time. They tipped over and that sort of thing, and the girls were along when they could be. And I'd have to say, now I've been through 9 administrations, I'd have to say that these are at the top of the list of children to come out of that very difficult world of the White House. It's not easy to raise kids, and therefore somebody did something well. One other little thing, too. When they dedicated the Reagan Library, I went out there, maybe you were there, Steve, and Pat Nixon flew out to be part of that group on the Reagan Library, and she got ill when she was out there. And I wrote a little piece for Time and mentioned that she kept saying, don't bother with me, just let me rest here, and that sort of thing. And almost before I got back, there was a letter from Nixon saying it was so wonderful of you to mention Pat in your piece about this library dedication. And I think the grief of him was so visible at her funeral was another indication of that, of a feeling maybe we didn't even know about.
Were you there at that funeral?
Yes, last June. It was a very, very emotional time.
He wrote about her, about the earlier days. He said, for her, the worst part of politics was campaigning, and through 2 strenuous California campaigns in 46 and 50, she had been at my side every step of the way and took it all with good grace. Although campaigning did not come easily to her because of her deep-rooted sense of privacy, she did it superbly. But now we actually had to consider the possibility of a long and grueling national campaign. This was when he was going to take the vice presidency with Mr. Eisenhower. She was having second thoughts about accepting the nomination and what it could mean to our young daughters.
You know, one of my colleagues, Bonnie Angelo of Time, and before that Newsday, knew Pat Nixon from the old days and traveled with him. And she noted that when Pat Nixon went abroad as First Lady, that when the airplane crossed the continental shelf, she got much more relaxed and open and had a good time. But when the airplane came back and she entered Washington again, she kind of clammed up. I think it's just part of the ritual.
I always felt that she was a woman who would have been most content to have spent her life raising her children in California, with her husband perhaps being a small-town attorney, for Mrs. Nixon to have continued as a school teacher and an amateur thespian, and that she did not crave the spotlight. She was a very good sport as a politician's wife and did everything asked of her, but she didn't need it. She didn't need the celebrity.
At the Yorba Linda in California, at the Richard Nixon Library in Yorba Linda, California, a lot of flowers, and people are coming there yesterday and today. We have some video of some of the flowers as they were arriving yesterday. As we take a call from Columbia, Maryland. Good morning.
Good morning. Hi, I'm 29 years old, and I didn't grow up during the beginning of the Cold War in the early 50s, but I've been hearing a lot of bad things that President Nixon was accused of in terms of red baiting and the things that he did back then. But then I read articles like in the big article in the last week edition of Time that talked about how those who made the atomic bomb were actively cooperating with the KGB on giving the Soviets the secrets to the atomic bomb. And it just seems like now that President Nixon was right in the end. Does this not vindicate the position he took at that time?
Mr. Sidey?
Well, this is a fascinating thing, and I'm interested to hear it brought up like that, because there are many evidences now, whether it's the Alger Hiss case, Whittaker Chambers, that whole time, the Un-American Affairs Committee, and now this new book by Gerald and by the Schechters on the fellow that ran the spy network, that suggests that at least some of Mr. Nixon's suspicions were correct, that there were communists under the bed, so to speak, quote unquote, which is another assessment history is going to make down the line.
You've been seeing some of those pictures from Yorba Linda, California, in the Nixon Library. The Associated Press has put out an address and a phone number that you can, where you can send messages or flowers, as they say. You'll see that at the bottom of your screen, and we will leave it there for a few moments, so if you need to run and get your pencil and paper. When we get to the point in time of the time in the White House, what was the most difficult part of being president for him?
Probably the final days of it, the final 6 months when, I mean, when truth be known, the place was darn near paralyzed by Watergate. We tried to pretend that it was otherwise, but the fact is that it was consuming nearly everyone's time. I mean, Mr. Sidey referred to that trip to the Soviet Union as that final trip when he was being received as a respected statesperson, but it wasn't that way in the United States, and it wasn't for the last 6 months, perhaps the final year.
You know, in those last briefings down at the White House, Ron Ziegler was doing the job he had to do, I guess, but he'd say the president's very much in charge and on the agenda. And I would go up to the Hill and talk to a congressman who's been there, and he said, who had been there, and he said that Mr. Nixon would open the meeting around the cabinet table and set the agenda, and then in about 5 minutes they'd look over and he was off in the distance. He had no more engagement with the issues being discussed. They said it was just a waste of time, that he was looking out the rose garden. He was devastated by it, and really not fully in charge, in my judgment.
Rochester, New York.
Good morning.
Good morning.
I have a couple of comments about Mr. Nixon. I remember the Watergate hearings extremely well. I'm somewhat disappointed by Mr. Sidey's recollection of those days and the positive spin that he is providing. In fact, I'm equally disappointed in Mr. Sidey's commentary, because I remember him on some of the panels and commenting on what went on in those days, 1972-73 time period. I believe, even though I am a Republican by party persuasion, I think Mr. Nixon was a very complex man, and his contributions are at best dubious. I think some of the people he surrounded himself with, Henry Kissinger, for example, was equally complex and with questionable contributions to the history. I'll leave it with probably a lighter note. Now that Mr. Nixon has passed away, do we know who the Deep Throat was? Thank you.
Do we know who Deep Throat is now that he's passed away?
Now, as I recall, either Woodward or Bernstein said they'd reveal it after Deep Throat passes away.
I just don't know. That's not ours. That's not Mr. Nixon's secret. Yeah. That's Woodward and Bernstein's secret.
Pacheco, California. Let me punch the button. Pacheco, California. Go ahead.
Good morning.
Good morning.
I wanted to say a couple things. First, I'm 43, and I remember the 1960 election quite clearly. I remember being told by a number of people that Nixon had lost that election by a very narrow margin, which if a lot of folks who were dead hadn't voted in Cook County, and if Cook County hadn't carried Illinois, and Nixon would have won that election. I heard that similar things went on in Johnson's, Texas. And I think that that engendered a feeling on the part of Dick Nixon that his enemies had done him in. And I think if that hadn't happened, that he might have turned out differently than he did. But I think that now is the time to put away all those foolish things that we don't like about a man once he passes, and give up criticizing him and show a little more compassion, a little more kindness, and a little more grace. Thank you.
Thank you very much, California. We have on the phone with us Robert Finch, who had a variety of positions with Mr. Nixon, including campaign manager for his 1960 presidential campaign. Is that correct, sir?
Right. I was was running his vice presidential office, and then we went from there to the campaign.
You are also mentioned in a variety of publications here as one of the president's good friends.
Well, we went back a long ways. It was right after the World War II when he was running for Congress, and I was a young Republican, and we worked together at that time, and it was a long-standing relationship. Yeah.
I want to ask you about something that our viewers have brought up a couple times, and that is the Kennedy-Nixon debates on television. Mm-hmm. You were there at that time?
Yes.
Some has written about the fact that he was not listening to you in terms of getting some kinds of medical attention at the time, that Mr. Nixon wasn't.
Well, the staff was very much opposed to us getting right out of the hospital bed and campaigning full tilt, and then jumping into the debate itself. And he was drawn out and had lost weight and had been in the hospital, but he was anxious to get on the road and into the campaign. But the day before the actual debate itself, the president insisted upon campaigning in Chicago and the outlying areas of Cook County. Then right up to the day before, and we finally then persuaded him to take the day off before he did it. But he went at it with an intensity I've never really seen before.
Did that intensity continue?
Of course, straight through.
In 1962, I understand that did you advise him not to run for governor of California?
Well, yes. I mean, his friends were equally divided, mostly divided on the point as to whether or not he physically had recovered from just the ordeal of the 60 campaign. The other aspect of it that most people of his friends were concerned about was that they knew that it would be very hard for any Californians to talk about California issues just after what he had been through. It was a close race, and they would always the reporters would always want to go back and talk about national and international issues, which made his position very hard in terms of getting across what he wanted to do if he were to be elected governor. So, but for those reasons, a good many of his friends did not want him to make that race, nor did Pat or the two girls.
In 1968, in his memoirs, he said he asked you to be his vice presidential candidate.
Well, we talked about it, and it was, of course, very tempting and very flattering, but it's such you have to really want to be
getting into it to commit to a full-time situation that cuts off an awful lot of what's worth living in life. And I would like to, the only office I really wanted was to be a senator at one point. But I'm very happy. I enjoyed my time in politics, and I was very flattered. But I knew it would have been under criticism because we were basically both Westerners, and I think it might have been a liability on the ticket.
You were with him the night of the election in 1968. What was it like?
Well, it was very gratifying. We were in New York, and we sat there and watched it come in. It was far different than 1960. And although it did run a little late in terms because of the uncertainty of the three-way split, but it was bittersweet.
Either of you have any questions for Mr. Finch?
No, I would comment on that first debate, though. I happened to be there. That was one of those curious nights in which I was on the pool in that campaign, and we rushed in, and the pool got left outside the broadcast area. So we listened to the debate on a Secret Service radio, huddled outside the studio, where I can't even remember where it was. And there were 3 or 4 of we reporters that said Nixon won. Nixon won, as we tabbed up the issues and that sort of thing. And of course, afterwards, when they'd seen it on television, and this is what Bob was talking about, the man had been ill, he looked bad, he had the perspiration on his lip and all of that stuff. Television changed that. Kennedy became the obvious winner, and many people believe that was the beginning of the end in that campaign for Richard Nixon.
Was television always unkind to Mr. Nixon, Mr. Finch?
Not always, but he was not telegenic. I think that's the only way to put it. And the general impression, of course, on the first debate was that it came across far better than Nixon did in radio, but in appearance there was no question.
Mr. Bull has been talking, and others have been talking about the personal Richard Nixon. What did you know of him personally?
Well, he's just a real workaholic. I mean, he went at things with an intensity. He was totally focused on what political chore was at hand, and I say with great respect. I mean, I just have never known anyone in business or political life that had the intensity of willingness and the effort to do well, and I think the others would agree.
What, finally, sir, what, besides Watergate, what would you say was his most difficult time in the White House? What was the issue? What was the worst for him?
I think the inability to persuade the American public to take what he believed would be the course that would shorten and end the war in Vietnam. I mean, that was difficult for all of us. It was most difficult for him.
Can you talk about how he felt about that?
Well, he was so determined to have this thing ended with the United States being the moral leader, and to avoid further bloodshed. But it just chewed at him, as Steve Bull and some of the others can tell him.
Mr. Finch, thanks very much for joining us. Sidey, that period?
Well, that was a very frustrating period for him. Look, no president likes to conduct wars, or I don't think I've run into anybody that wants to send Americans over there to die, and Mr. Nixon didn't either. But there is no question that, at least for a while, he thought that the application of more force would indeed bring about some kind of an end, that he could force it, and it didn't work, of course, and so he finally had to begin to get out, and that was a very tough time.
Mr. Bull, would you agree that that was one of his most difficult times?
Yes, but it doesn't compare to the final months of the Watergate period.
Lewiston, Pennsylvania.
Yes, I have a few comments. I wanted to comment on the caller earlier stating about releasing Mr. Kissinger on us and some of the comments were made earlier about him destroying our democracy. Well, it's nice to hear friends and foes come out in this democracy and be able to speak freely about a great man as Mr. Nixon. And it's nice to see you there backing him up a little bit and speaking fondly of him. I think he brought to the arena some of the best political minds in this country. And we have definitely lost one of our best foreign policy minds in the world.
Thanks very much for your call. If I can get this all up here, I wanted to show our viewers again the New York Times Week in Review. Tom Wicker, who has done a biography on the president, writes about what he says an indomitable man and incurable loneliness. And he, down here, quotes, if only someone had loved him, Kissinger had once said, Richard Nixon would have been a great, great man. Do you have have you heard that quote before?
I read it this morning.
You read it
and it's an interesting quote.
Well, I've heard that before. Kissinger did talk about it, and he was, I think, talking, well, Kissinger can speak for himself, but he did say in the early years, particularly if just somebody loved him, it would have changed. I think Kissinger at this time still thinks he'll emerge in history as a great man.
In his memoirs, President Nixon said this, I love my parents equally, but in very different ways, just as they were very different people. My father was a scrappy, belligerent fighter with a quick, wide-ranging, raw intellect. He left me a respect for learning and hard work and the will to keep fighting no matter what the odds. My mother loved me completely and selflessly, and her special legacy was a quiet inner peace and the determination never to despair. You knew him pretty well. What did you... Did he ever talk about his parents to you?
No, we didn't have the private, personal conversations of that nature. I mean, the nature of my position was such that I served him as an aide, and I knew my place in that relationship. But you know, Mr. Sidey mentioned earlier that comparing him to John F. Kennedy, I mean, a very vigorous, telegenic, likable, affable public figure. I think Mr. Nixon knew that he was never going to be a John F. Kennedy, and he was never going to be perceived as that likable person. Whether it's the result of upbringing or whatever, the fact is he was a quiet, perhaps shy individual who kept his own counsel in emotional affairs and perhaps just took solace in a strong family relationship.
He did show a little bit of that in his speech at the when he left the White House to the staff, when he talked about his mother, and we have the clip of that, the famous clip of that we want to show our viewers right now.
There are many fine careers. This country needs good farmers, good businessmen, good plumbers, good carpenters. I remember my old man. I think that they would have called him sort of a little man, a common man. He didn't consider himself that way. You know what he was? He was a streetcar motorman first, and then he was a farmer, and then he had a lemon ranch. It was the poorest lemon ranch in California, I can assure you. He sold it before they found oil on it. And then he was a grocer. But he was a great man. Because he did his job. And every job counts, up to the hilt, regardless of what happened. Nobody will ever write a book, probably, about my mother. Well, I guess all of you would say this about your mother. My mother was a saint. And I think of her, 2 boys dying of tuberculosis, nursing 4 others in order that she could take care of my older brother for 3 years in Arizona, and seeing each of them die And when they died, it was like one of her own. Yes, she will have no books written about her. But she was a saint.
Mr. Sidey?
One of the curious observations that I've made over all of my years covering the White House is that most of these presidents, I've just made a list of them, were products of strong mothers. They, you go right back, Lyndon Johnson, Nixon, as he says, Carter, Miss Lillian, Ronald Reagan, the mother that kept the family together, Bush's mother, Dorothy, very strong, Clinton's mother, the biggest influence in his life. What is that? I'm not a psychologist or a sociologist, but the mother emerges stronger than normal in that family among these fellows that run for the presidency. And Nixon, I think, felt the same thing.
That had to be one of the roughest moments of that speech that day. You remember it?
Roughest on the president or roughest on the staff?
Well, it looked like both.
It looked like it. You see, tears were flowing among the staff people there. It was the first time that people had seen, I think for many people, even on the staff, it was the first time that they had seen the person and the emotion of Richard Nixon.
Omasa's, Florida. Florida, you there? Oh, it's too bad. I'm sorry. We lost Florida. Let's try to take another call from Grand Junction, Colorado. Go ahead.
Yeah, I have a question of Steve Bull. I have a question of Hugh, but just that piece, I have to give a personal reflection if I can. I grew up in Whittier, and my first knowledge of Dick Nixon was when I was about 7 years old in 1946. My parents used to shop at the Nixon Market in East Whittier, and doing some shopping, and Mrs. Nixon putting a brochure in the shopping bag saying, "Now you be sure and vote for Dick. He's running for Congress." So it's kind of interesting to see that thing about Mrs. Nixon and then remembering back to some of these reflections. As I say, I grew up in Whittier, so I've had a interrelationship with the president basically all my life. When I was working in public relations at Whittier College back in 1970, had a chance to accompany the graduating class back to the White House for a reunion. And we also made a presentation, or put together a presentation to have the Nixon Library located on the Whittier College campus. And we always got runarounds from his aides, primarily Ehrlichman, Haldeman, and then Kalmbach was involved with it. And later on we found out that they were not reporting to the president, that Whittier College was even interested in the library at that time, because he mentioned, it got back to us, that he was disappointed that Whittier College was not interested in his library, and we'd made a pretty good presentation for it. And I just wondered, was the president, and this primarily is Steve first, and then maybe Hugh Sidey could answer this, was the president ill-served by his aides, primarily Ehrlichman and Haldeman, in keeping information from him?
Mr. Bull?
The short answer is sometimes he sure was. And I think sometimes when you look back at the origin of Watergate and how the events came about, you look at the communication channels there, and you have to say he was very ill-served.
I think it goes both ways. As Steve says, sometimes it was. I think that probably Ehrlichman and Haldeman saved Nixon from some dark impulses that never should have gotten out. They just didn't do anything about it. But likewise, they probably didn't report some things that maybe they should have, and he perhaps should have known. I have to say, I think that's true in every White House, including the current one right now.
Manhattan, go ahead, New York.
Hello. I was not a fan of Richard Nixon's when he was president. I should say I voted for him, but I was not an admirer of his presidency. But I was a little distressed earlier when Mr. Bull and Mr. Sidey made no comment about the caller who in essence trashed him for his treatment of Helen Gahagan Douglas and Alger Hiss, because it seems to me that the evidence is really very extensive. That Helen Gahagan Douglas was to the extreme left of the Democratic Party. She had virtually no support within the party. She was part of the sort of pro-Stalinist left with Lillian Hellman, and it seems, unless there's something I don't know, that Alger Hiss was as guilty as hell, and that there's as much evidence that Alger Hiss was guilty as that Neil Armstrong walked on the moon. And
Mr. Sidey?
Well, I did mention earlier that the evidence is beginning to show that far stronger connections with communist sympathy than we had thought before. And he's absolutely right. I think the evidence is overwhelming about Alger Hiss's involvement, and I think in these others too. I also have to say, if you go back and read some of those old speeches in those campaigns, they're pretty mild compared to what happens today. But there are one or two lines that were picked up in that very charged environment back there that stuck. But basically, you know, that dialogue doesn't even begin to compare with what goes on now in some of these campaigns.
Anything to add, Mr. Poe?
Other than the fact that Richard Nixon's adversaries, particularly those who were involved in his first campaigns, are never going to forgive him for the Helen Cahig and Douglas attacks. He's never going to be forgiven for some of his actions on the House Un-American Activities Committee, and the defenders of Alger Hiss are never going to forgive him for all that he did to put Hiss under.
Manhattan again, go ahead.
Oh, hello.
Hi.
I just wanted to mention the 1960 election again. Somebody mentioned that in passing, and it engendered no discussion. But I feel it is of great historical importance, the fact that election was stolen and the impact it had on Nixon and his men. Mr. Sidey earlier was saying that the press had been unfair during the 1960 election, and that later, I think that led to Nixon's feeling of animosity towards the press, and that was an understandable human reaction. If someone's unfair to you, then you feel that way, and maybe try to be defensive later on. But in the same way, the stealing of the election from him must have made him feel, something was stolen, and that had a reaction as well later on. Robert Bork, who knew him well, said that he felt, one of his downfalls was he felt he had to be as tough and play as hardball as Kennedy and Johnson did. And that might have, led, to his people feeling they had to do things like Watergate. But, even though he didn't know himself what was going on, but there was that whole mentality of defensiveness because of what had happened in 1960.
Okay, thanks very much. Was the election stolen?
Well, in 1960, I was just a college student. I wasn't involved in that campaign. Whether it was or wasn't, I always admired the fact that Richard Nixon, for perhaps not to sully the presidency or to endanger the democratic process, never did seriously contest an election that quite possibly was influenced by some of the dealers.
But I think also he looked at it very hard, in a very hard manner, and he calculated the odds there. And there were also many stories about Republicans stealing votes from downstate Illinois, and so I think that probably Nixon thought, well, if we get into it, you're going to find as much on one side as the other side. So I'm not so sure it was that overt larceny that we tend to talk about in legend. A couple other comments on what he said. I should clarify a little about my feeling about the press in 1960, because Nixon had the bulk of the publishers and the editorial pages of the country with him on that. It was the working press, generally we reporters, that were so enamored of Kennedy and favorable to him that our stories, I think, by and large, did tilt towards Mr. Kennedy. But I don't think that Nixon was that bitter about the press there over that election. I didn't see that it was directed at the press as such.
Sturgis, South Dakota, go ahead.
Good morning. I'm 47 years old. I was living in Washington, D.C. during the time that President Nixon was in office. And I would like to take this occasion to thank the Nixon family, Tricia and Julie, for all that they did on behalf of their parents. We as baby boomers watched them grow. They handled their roles as children of the president in an exemplary way, and I think set a standard for all of us to look up to and appreciate in the years to come. My sympathy to them all. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Mr. Sidey, you already talked about the girls. Did you have any communication with the girls over the years?
Yes, I have. Of course, back in the White House, I used to deal with them on a constant basis. But I want to thank the gentleman who just called. It's a wonderful family. I believe it was Winston Churchill who noted that a man's finest monument is his family, and it is a remarkable, wonderful family.
You know, in that period, which surely must have been the most difficult for two young women in the Watergate period, they never really defended the wrongdoing of their father. They did not, condone it or excuse it. On the other hand, they never deserted their father and never disgraced him. It was a remarkable performance by two young women.
Burlington, Vermont, go ahead.
I want to talk about President Nixon's ability to come back again and again. I think he lived his life by that example. And I think when his mother was gravely ill, if you remember, he had told his mother not to give up, and she turned back to him and said, "Dick, don't you ever give up." And I think he lived his life that way. But I do think that he had an ongoing battle with the press. I remember a press conference where he, in fact, said to the press, I don't remember what spurred him to say it, but that he said that, "Don't think that I hate you, because you can only hate the ones that you respect." And the press was just in total shock that he would say that to them. But I think he definitely had an ongoing battle with the press. I think it went back to Gehage and Douglas, as you say. But I think that the press did partly relish going after him over Watergate. I think that Watergate, while he did have some wrongdoing, that there's no question about that. I don't think he did anything more than LBJ did. But they had the Democrats controlling Congress back then. And Kennedy, I mean, LBJ had wiretaps. Nixon had the documents on the wiretaps that LBJ did, illegal wiretaps. Now, if LBJ had investigations done on him, I don't doubt that he would have squashed any investigations with the Democrats in Congress. So I think Nixon, while he definitely abused his power, I think he was partly hounded out of office by the press and by the Democrats in Congress. And I'd like to hear the reactions from the two of you. Thanks.
Well, here again, it's very difficult to suggest that we didn't really kind of relish Nixon. The combat, the fight, without question. It's fascinating. When I first arrived in town, I listened to these old warriors that had seen Nixon up there on the Un-American Affairs Committee, and they were bitter and nasty about him, but they kind of liked it. And there was that kind of a grudging admiration for an enemy back and forth. But did we hound him out of office? No. Richard Nixon committed the sins that finally got him. He did that. There's going to be excess always with a free press. We're going to do things that we shouldn't do. We're going to go too far. But basically, I think this was really, put it down to its simplest form, an excellent example of how the adversary relationship should work.
Mr. Bull, did you see that too?
Sure, and didn't you miss him after he was gone?
I was telling Steve beforehand, 37 years of writing about this man. Teddy White, who wrote the books on the making of the president, he's dead now, but the last lunch I had with Teddy was out at the 80 Democratic Convention, and I remember Teddy had a nice, strong martini and said, "Hugh, I've spent my entire adult life writing about Richard Nixon. Do you understand that?" And it suddenly occurred to me all of this time. And I was in California when he died that night, and it was like a member of the family had gone. You know, a security blanket. There's Richard Nixon you write about.
I remember in the '88 campaigns, that there were T-shirts being sold on the street that said "Tan, rested, and ready, Nixon in '88." I mean, it was a joke, but they were still talking about him.
And they had them in '92 as well.
And they had him in.
But you know, in my business, it was almost as if Nixon had never left the Oval Office. There were a few little pauses along the way, but then suddenly he's back, going to Russia, filing these reports with Clinton, wherever, and I'd call him up or go up, and we'd talk about the same issues up in Woodcliff, New Jersey, that we talked about in the White House.
Titusville, Florida.
Good morning.
Good morning.
In The Making of the President, 1960, Teddy White, who was kind of a Kennedy toady, gave Nixon quite a bit of credit for not contesting the Illinois results. And his spin on it was quite different from Mr. Sidey's, which he stated a few minutes ago. Also, I thought it was interesting in Carl Bernstein's memoirs, he talked about the fact that his parents were quite active in the Communist Party. In fact, I believe it was his mother who was hauled up before the HUAC. That provided a kind of personal bias which drove his animus toward Nixon. I thought it was curious that throughout the whole Watergate affair, I don't recall that ever being mentioned. So, in my mind, there's no question that the left and their friends in the media hated Nixon for his anti-communist activities. I think history bears out that Nixon was on the right side of history.
Well, here we come back to this, the H word again, hate, and I just, it's very difficult. I'm not going to, we shouldn't visit the sins of parents on children. The Bernstein accusation, I think, is totally unfair and out of line. That what parents do and what children do, you know, that's another thing. Teddy White, you call him a toady of John Kennedy? No, Teddy White liked John Kennedy. Teddy White was free. He wasn't allied with any newspaper or any network. He wrote books. He decided he was the better candidate. I thought it was a very fair and even-handed account. And as a matter of fact, Richard Nixon liked Teddy White and dealt with him, talked to him all through then and later on.
In his 1992 conversation with us, President Nixon looked back a little bit on his life and talked about what he thought of it. Let's take a look at what he had to say.
The last time I saw it, you're 79 years old? 79, yes. When's your 80th birthday? Well, it's too close. It's 11 months from now. Would you say that you have a happy life? And are you surprised that, based on all the things you've done in your life, that at where you are? Well, I'm, oh yes, yes. But when you speak of a happy life, I'm not among those that think that when you judge a person, or a life, that the question is, are you having fun? That isn't the test. The test is it a satisfying thing? Did you accomplish something? And that is what gives you the happiness in the broadest sense as you have described it. I've reached an age, incidentally, where I was rather surprised when I came in, one of your associates out here say, "Ma, you look very well." And I reached that age that Dean Rusk describes so well. He describes the 3 ages of man. And he said, youth, middle age, and my, you're looking well. So under the circumstances, I trust I do. As a matter of fact, when I point out that I spend a lot of time in the office, I am doing what I didn't do in the White House. In the White House, I played golf only 5 times in 5.5 years. And I had virtually no exercise, sometimes swimming when we went to Florida and up to Camp David and the pool. But now my sole exercise is walking. I walk between 4 to 5 miles a day, about 2 miles in the morning and 2 miles at night. And that's what keeps me, if I am in good shape, that keeps me in shape. And also some of the best ideas come when you're walking. I found in talking to Adenauer and de Gaulle, Yoshida, de Gasperi, these great people that I've had the opportunity to know, that many, virtually to a man, they said they got good ideas when walking by themselves. So I follow their example.
Steve Bull, your reaction to that?
He's a man whose joy in life was his work. He's a man who lived 81 years and I think never thought of retirement. I'm not sure if he ever took a vacation in his life. His enjoyment was his work. I think his enjoyment was traveling internationally and meeting with foreign leaders and continuing to analyze and to gather information.
Former British Prime Minister Sir Edward Heath is on the line with us this morning from London. Good morning, sir.
Good morning.
Thank you for joining us. You, do you remember the first time you met Mr. Nixon?
Yes, I do indeed, yes.
What was it like?
Well, it was a solemn occasion because he came over as Vice President for the unveiling of the new part of St. Paul's Cathedral, which had been damaged in the war. And I met him after that. And I was very impressed with him because of his genial attitude towards everybody present, and because of the earnestness with which he treated the special service.
You were Prime Minister in the early 70s when he was President.
I was Prime Minister from 1970 to 1974.
Right.
And he was President.
Do you have any recollections of any of the meetings you might have held or the issues that you might have had to deal with?
Oh, I've got recollections of all of them, yes. And we got on very well together. He knew that we differed on a number of points, but he understood that. And he appreciated our reasons for so doing.
What do you think that Mr. Nixon will be remembered differently in other countries like yours than he's being remembered here in the United States?
I think he will be remembered, yes, I agree with that, but I think also that given a few years, the historians will then get a better balance in the United States. They will recognize the major part which he played in dealing with the Cold War and in showing that you could be very determined about your policy, but that both sides could manage to work together if they tried. They will remember that he brought the Vietnamese War to a conclusion. They will remember that he opened up a new future with China. And they may not remember, but we will always remember that he backed me and my government on becoming members of the European Community, now the European Union. And that will then set into context the whole question of the problems at the end of his period as president.
Sir Edward Heath, thank you for joining us, British Prime Minister in the early 70s, and also had known President Nixon very well. We are out of time for this segment. Thank you both for joining us. Hugh Sidey, and now contributing writer for Time Magazine. And Steve Bull, what are you doing now?
I'm the Government Relations Director for the United States Olympic Committee.
And was an aide to the former president for how many years?
5.5 years.
Thank you both for joining us. Coming up next, a montage of the different presidents speaking about President Nixon at the opening of the Nixon Library.
My first meeting with Dick Nixon came in January of 1949 at the start of the 81st Congress. When I was sworn in as a freshman member, Congressman Dick Nixon was a veteran second-termer, already renowned as the nemesis of Alger Hiss. Quite frankly, you never really forget the senior members who treat you kindly and give you a hand when you come to the Congress. Betty and Pat became good friends, while their husbands oftentimes neglected them in the pursuit of things that we thought important, very wrongly. In 1951, as you may remember, Dick, I invited Senator Nixon, who had meanwhile moved to the other body, to come to our annual Lincoln Day dinner in Grand Rapids, Michigan. He came to the Old Row Hotel, gave his typical stem-winding, rockin' sock'em campaign speech. The only problem, both the lights and the microphone went off at the climax of his speech. Dick passed it off with a joke. But despite the blackout, or despite the joke, I was reelected to the last Republican House we have had in 4 decades. My guest was elected vice president, and we all thought the Republic was safe forever.
What President Nixon said of Dwight Eisenhower in a '69 eulogy was true, also of himself. He came from the heart of America, not geographically perhaps, but culturally. And Richard Nixon was the quintessence of middle America and touched deep chords of response in millions of our citizens. As president, upholding what he termed the silent majority from Dallas to Davenport, Syracuse to Siler City, he loved America's good, quiet, decent people. And he spoke for them. He felt deeply on their behalf. Teddy White, Theodore White would say, middle America has been without a great leader for generations, and in Richard Nixon, it elevated a man of talent and ability. For millions of Americans, this president became something they had rarely known, a voice speaking loudly and eloquently for those values, their values, and their dreams.
Much has been written and said about Richard Nixon, Some of it's even been true. Journalists, historians, political pundits, and just plain folks will talk for decades about his career and what it meant to our country and to the world. It will come as no surprise to anyone here that there will always be a good deal of debate about Richard Nixon. Generally speaking, people in public life who take bold steps, who make tough decisions, and who show great courage generate controversy. Such is the fate of the man in the arena.
At the Nixon Library dedication in July of 1990, where a variety of the former presidents spoke, I think all of the living former presidents were there for the opening of that library. Ambassador Molly Razor, the Chief of Protocol for the United States, can you give us a rundown of what's going to be happening this week in terms of the funeral arrangements and your side of it for President Nixon?
All right. First of all, the Military District of Washington, in the person of Tom Graupel, has plans for a state funeral, any state funeral. What we are doing, obviously, is modifying that because the Nixon's family does not want a state funeral. The plane will be going out, I believe it's Tuesday, from New York. It will lie in repose at the library, and then the funeral services will take place on Wednesday.
As Chief of Protocol, what are your responsibilities in this area?
Right. We have several responsibilities. We have set up a task force at the State Department, headed by Harlan Lee, who is our administrative officer. Part of the task force involves protocol officers. It also involves people representing the bureaus, the Asian Bureau, the African Bureau, the European Bureau, so that as representatives of embassies call in, we can answer questions. And representatives of embassies have been calling in. What we do initially is send out a formal protocol announcement, announcing the death and putting in as much as we can on information on where the funeral will be, who will be invited.
Who does that go to?
That goes to chiefs of mission in Washington, all the ambassadors. And then they check with their countries to see if any foreign delegations will be coming. That telegram went out yesterday afternoon, so we are just beginning to hear now from some of the embassies. And we do expect some heads of state, but we're going to wait till later in the day or perhaps tomorrow till we get a more full list before we release that.
Will there be any ceremony at all in Washington?
No. He will not be coming to Washington. The body will not be coming to Washington.
And when it arrives in California, what are the plans there?
When it arrives in California, there will be a motorcade which will take it to the library, and the family has said that if the public would like to come and see the motorcade and its arrival at the library, that would be fine. That will be about 1 o'clock Pacific time.
On Tuesday.
Tuesday. And then it will lie in repose from 3 o'clock until 11 o'clock Wednesday morning.
And then what are the actual plans for the funeral that you can tell us about?
Well, the family is doing that. The eulogists will be Governor Pete Wilson. I think this has been in the paper already. Senator Dole, Henry Kissinger, and President Clinton.
And after that, where will he be buried?
He will be buried on the grounds of the library, and that's a private interment.
Tell us a little bit about the different agencies. You mentioned different agencies have different responsibilities in this. Is this a plan that happens for any president?
For any state funeral, there's a plan. The way there is for a state arrival, there is a plan. And then they're modified according to the wishes of the family. So, for instance, when President Johnson, as a former president, died, he came back and he laid in state at the Capitol. And then there was a church service, and then he was taken out by plane, Air Force plane, provided by the government, to Texas. And we are providing, the president is providing a plane to take the remains of the former president and the family out to California on Tuesday.
And what about the differing agencies? What are the different agencies involved, and what are their responsibilities? You mentioned earlier the one that you have.
Right.
At the state. Well, you're under the State Department?
I'm under the State Department, yes. And then we will take care of any foreign heads of state that arrive and do seating and that kind of thing. Department of Defense is in charge of all military affairs. Military people to stand by the casket, military people to carry the casket. I'm not quite sure of the exact details of what's going on at this one. If it were a formal state funeral, there would be marching bands, all that up Constitution Avenue. And so that's Department of Defense. The White House takes care of the president's involvement. And I believe the president is obviously going to speak. He will be flying out, and I believe he will be taking a delegation that is still being made up on Air Force One.
How big of a staff do you have working on this?
Well, the protocol office has a staff of 70. We have, anybody's available. Right now we have 3 people in the Operations Center office, but anybody can be called upon. We also have, as we speak, 4 people going out to California to help with plans out there with the foreign visitors.
And how many, do you have any idea how many people on that the family has working from their end?
No, I don't. They have a lot, which is why we're happy we have Tom Groppel, who is the liaison. And he's working with the family and with the library people, and then gets back to us and to the White House on that.
Do you have a certain number of seats that will be available?
That depends on the number of people who want to come. It's my understanding that there are quite a few seats available. Initially, it was going to be very small, and then I think the family realized that it was difficult to keep it small. So they have enlarged it a great deal.
Is it more difficult when you have a state funeral, or because you have a plan, is it easier to implement than at a time when, as the Nixon family has done, said, no, we're just going to have things in California?
Well, a state funeral here is very elaborate. So I think it's a lot more work to have a state funeral in Washington, as I say, with the bands and the carrying of the casket to the cathedral and back to the Capitol. This is probably easier.
Thank you for joining us, Ambassador Molly Razor, Chief of Protocol of the United States. And that concludes our Sunday Journal for today. We'd like to remind you that at 8 p.m. Eastern Time tonight, we will be showing you in its entirety one of the hours of the interviews with the former president. You saw some clips of it earlier today. We'll be showing you in it 1 hour of that tonight, beginning it again at 8 p.m. Eastern Time. And also, we will be airing live in its entirety the funeral on Wednesday. Thanks for joining us. Have a good day.
The C-SPAN Sunday Journal airs live here on C-SPAN Sunday mornings beginning at 9 a.m. Eastern Time, 6 on the West Coast. We have this programming note. Monday morning's live viewer call-in features William Grider, national editor of Rolling Stone magazine, and Rolling Stone columnist P.J. O'Rourke. They'll discuss national and world politics, talk about their recent columns, and take your calls. A live viewer call-in Monday at 8 a.m. Eastern Time, 5 Pacific. Here's a look at what's ahead on our program schedule. Next, Part 2 of our South Africa election preview. The program looks at South Africa's President F.W. de Klerk of the National Party and Chief Minister Mangosuthu Buthelezi of the Inkatha Freedom Party. At 5:55, from the British House of Commons in London, Question Time with Prime Minister John Major. At 6:55, the second part of a 1992 Book Notes interview with former President Richard Nixon. In that hour-long conversation, Mr. Nixon discusses his book, Seize the Moment. And at 8, a live viewer call-in program with William Grider and P.J. O'Rourke of Rolling Stone magazine. In that 90-minute program, they'll take your comments and phone calls and talk about the latest headline news stories. And that's some of what's ahead on C-SPAN.
Kumana matolo amurela baeti amurela baeti lido kumana matolo